Hello and welcome to another edition of Revive and Thrive. This is episode 11, and I'm your host, Joshua Blum. I'm a psychiatrist, and for the past 11 episodes, we've been going through the letter of the alphabet. So this episode is brought to you by the letter K, and that stands for kids. And so for every letter of the alphabet, we've been talking about a topic that deals with burnout, specifically for physicians and specifically for fathers. I'm not actually going to be talking too much about being a father, because if you're listening to this, you already are, and you know that. You live your life. That's part of your life. So that wouldn't be terribly interesting to talk about, because that's everyday life. But what I thought we would talk about actually is some of the things that kids, i.e. like childhood, kind of represents. If you're listening to this podcast, anybody could listen to it, but this was created for physician fathers. We face some unique pressures, and being a physician, it's a serious job. There's no real denying it. Yes, there are high points. There's also some low points. Being a father is, of course, being a parent just in general is a big responsibility. When you combine those two together, you end up with a lot of serious stuff. There are some of you, and I can certainly speak from experience here because it's my life. You work during the day. You come home or you finish your job, and then the other job starts, which is in some ways maybe the more important job, but it is the other job that doesn't have a shift. There's no time when it ends or begins. It just is all the time. And that's the job of a parent. When that starts to become every day, it's easy to see how it can feel like you're always working. Now, of course, that doesn't last forever. Children, of course, grow up and so forth. But there's an interesting part of that because we're talking specifically about burnout. That's what this whole podcast is about, little actionable steps you can do to try to combat burnout in some way. When we think about burnout, that's just a term that gets thrown around a lot. But really, what is it? What is the essence of it? For the past several months, we've been talking about it in various different ways. One of the things that often is true about it as a phenomenon, it's not a medical diagnosis or anything like that, but as just a descriptive term, is this sense that really whatever you do, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. It's a sense of like running on a treadmill and going nowhere. It's a sort of a slog to get through every day. And there's a bunch of things, of course, that contribute to that, and many things in the world of a physician can, of course, contribute to that. And we've talked about a number of ways to possibly work on that. One of the things we talked about in a previous episode is the idea of finding passion in what you do, but it has to be in your actual work, because no amount of vacations or wellness classes or yoga instruction or whatever can take the place of the fact that there's a good portion of what you're doing that's work related. And if that sucks, you can only wrap up a turd so much. It's still a turd, right? So if there has to be a way of turning it into something less turd-like for it to not be draining. And really, if it's turd-like, why do it? Life is only so long, right? One of the reasons I wanted to pick this particular episode to talk about is when we think about children. Yes, of course, children are a lot of work and so forth. But if we think about the world of a child and specifically the mind of a child, one of the things that also makes them very enjoyable is the fact that when children kind of see things, especially young children, they see things for in the moment. And you inherently know this as a parent if you're trying to get your kids to put on their clothes or brush their teeth or whatever, leave the house. Think about, especially if you have young children, trying to get them to leave the house. Transition from, let's just say, eating breakfast to getting on the school bus or getting in the car to go to school. A lot of things can happen between now and then. A lot of little distractions can get in the way. Now, as a parent, we often see this as, why can't you just go from one thing to the next? Why can't you do what you're told? Why can't you just put on your socks and your shoes and walk out to the car or walk outside or whatever it is, right? They get stuck. To a child, especially a young child, the world is all new. They're exploring everything. Everything is interesting. The world is a series of snapshots. Now it becomes more strung together as we get older. But especially for a young child, we have these moments in time and they're flashing before us and everything is new. Everything is exploration. Everything is why is this happening? Why is the sky blue? Why is the earth round? Is the world made of atoms? What's smaller than an atom? All these questions that kids have that they'll ask as they're falling asleep in the middle of doing something else when you're like, why can't you just focus on what you're doing? So as important as focus is, and we talked about that in a previous episode, sometimes it's also important to break the rules. Sometimes it's also important to let the mind wander, let the mind be unfocused, and have sort of a childlike experience of things. Children can run in a sprinkler and be happy. Children can be satisfied with very simple things. Sometimes as adults, we get so caught up in the end goal of where we're supposed to be and being productive and being on time and meeting expectations, specifically usually other people's expectations, but sometimes our own expectations, the expectations of other people's that have gotten internalized into our own checklist of things that we want to do. We forget to actually enjoy ourselves along the way. If you ever try to take a kid hiking, especially a small child, you know how long it can take, because there's a path that you follow, right? You follow the marked path. You have the blazes along the trees, and you follow the blue blazes or whatever it is, You may take their hand and say, we're going to walk along the path and we're going to start here and we're going to end up there. But to a child, those kind of rules don't exist yet. Now they will after they've been socialized to do X, Y, or Z, right? But in the beginning, no one tells the kid that you're supposed to do that. And so they get sidetracked by all the things that are on the ground, all the things that they can see, all the stuff that you may not pay attention to because you're busy saying like, okay, we have to start here and get there. And we're going to go on this path, and we're not going to mess around with the things off the path. So you can see, talking literally, but also figuratively. You give a kid a small child, like a 3 or 4 year old, something that they haven't seen before, and they start playing with it. And then someone sometimes at some point will come along and say, no, that's not how you use that thing. That thing is, let's say it's a stapler. And they say, no, that's not for you to play with. That could be dangerous. Or you don't use that as a truck. That's for stapling things. Now, maybe an adult with more of an imagination wouldn't say that. Adult who recognizes kids for what they and how they play, but that happens again and again. You get told like, no. Your way of doing it, the beginner's way of doing it, the novice's way of doing it, the person who isn't in the know, that's not how you do it. It's part of being a beginner. So I guess in many ways, I'm talking about what we call the beginner's mind. The beginner's mind is very interesting because when we start something new, we see it with fresh eyes. There's sometimes a reason why, as attending physicians, we sometimes won't see something that, say, someone who's not in medicine or a medical student or an observer who has minimal training, who's just sort of getting in on the process, might spot, because we're used to seeing things in a particular progression. We're used to the kind of pattern recognition that's needed for us to make those jumps. Sometimes those jumps we make in logic cause us to skip things or forget things or overlook things that someone who is either new to it and is going through things very thoroughly or just has a fresh point of view will not miss. You may have noticed this with, people who are, say like medical students. Maybe you're precepting them, maybe they're residents, and they'll go through things in a kind of thorough way, and they'll create like a differential diagnosis for different things that could be happening here. And you'll think about some of those things. You'll be like, okay, yeah, that's the textbook answer, but in some of these cases, but what you said, like a lot of those things, like that never happens, but yet they do every now and then, mostly then. So sometimes it actually is helpful to have multiple different points of view that are fresh like that, right? Because it keeps us from going down those same ruts, those same roads that everybody else does. The mind of a child is sort of not hierarchical, right? As we get older, we tend to see this for folks that have difficulties with attention. They have difficulty putting things in order of doing things first, then next, then, a logical flow, right? They tend to kind of see and experience the world in a more like flat or horizontal way where everything's kind of coming at them all at once. And what is done and what's focused on is kind of most stimulating or exciting at the time. Of course, that can create some issues at times, right? In terms of focus, but that's often what children will do. And that sometimes following that in some situations can lead them to be out of the box thinkers and approach things, in a fresh way. So what I'll say to this is that when you're with your kids, when you're playing with them, when you're talking with them, when you're answering the the same question they've asked for the millionth time, don't necessarily be in too much of a hurry, or experiment with not necessarily being in so much of a hurry to give them the straightforward, matter-of-fact answer. Ask them why. Adults ask a lot of questions of kids. They're like, why did you do this? What do you think about this? And that's not a bad thing. But a lot of times kids don't necessarily know what to say to adults because they think that adults, they want to give adults what adults want, right? And they kind of learn over time that that's what adults may want certain things. And so they may tailor the responses to them. But children often, if you watch them, they will make a lot of statements that seem to come out of nowhere. They'll walk up to you and say something that's totally like out of nowhere. And you're like, where did that possibly come from? Because that's what they were thinking at that time. And it may have nothing to do with what you were talking about or what was going on in the context, but that's what's going through their head, and that's what they blurt out. And so you can have a whole, I guess you could say, conversation with a young child by just making a series of random statements and seeing what they say. And they'll probably do the same thing to you. Now, an older kid may start to think this is weird because they're in a more adult way of thinking. But for smaller children who live more spontaneously, that's it's like a slightly different thing. And so in that sometimes lies a little bit more spontaneity, a kind of a fresh way of looking at things. The beginner's mind is not necessarily something to be passed over because eventually you may end up back in that state of wonder and looking at things freshly. There's I may be misquoting the aphorism, but there's an idea. I think I'm using it in the context of like martial arts where I've heard it, but it could be really with anything. And it's sort of this idea of like to a novice or to a beginner, a tree is just a tree. But then to a student, a tree is much more than a tree. And then to a master, a tree is again just a tree. But it's not really, right? Because the person who's put in a lot of time and effort, like that master who's reached a level of mastery, they can appreciate all the complexity and all the other things that go into that tree, but they can also see it for what it is and put all that aside and enjoy it for just being a tree. Whereas a beginner couldn't see all the complexity and they just kind of see it at very superficial face value. So in kind of re-engaging with that childlike state, the beginner's mind, it allows us to ultimately kind of transcend and get beyond some of the weeds so we can again see things in kind of a simple and childlike way. Not necessarily childish, but childlike way, which can sometimes bring new life into whatever we're doing. So it's something to play around with, right? Something to experiment in how you go about your day and see the world, and something that we can learn from our children. That's it for this week. I want to thank you for listening and wish you a good weekend and a good week, and I'll talk to you next time.